3 days from now. Sherlock Holmes was supposed to die, not according to a doctor, not according to an enemy, but according to a photograph of a funeral, Holmes's funeral. And the most impossible part? The date on the headstone showed his death would happen 3 days in the future. But the real question was not how the photograph was made. The real question was, who already knew Holmes was going to die? Before we begin tonight's mystery, welcome to Final Deduction Diaries, a place where every story is a puzzle waiting to be solved. And if you're listening right now, you're not just a viewer, you're part of this investigation. So tell me something in the comments before the mystery begins. Where are you watching from tonight? And how old are you? Detectives come from every corner of the world, and it's always fascinating to see how far Holmes's stories travel. Write your country or city and your age in the comments below. Now, settle in. Let the noise of the day fade away, because tonight's case begins on a very quiet winter evening in London. Chapter 1. The Lamplit Threshold. Winter has a particular way of quieting a city, and London in late January knew this better than most. The rooftops had gathered a thin dusting of snow sometime before dusk, and now, with the last gray light folding itself beneath the horizon, the great restless capital had begun to do what it rarely did: lower its voice. Cab wheels turned more softly on the whitened streets. The gas lamps along Baker Street burned inside halos of frost, each one a small golden world unto itself, and between them the fog moved with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. A church bell sounded twice from the direction of Marylebone, the notes traveling low and unhurried across the rooftops, losing their edges against the snow before they arrived at the window of anyone still listening. Let your breath slow, if it will. Let whatever you are resting against take more of your weight, the pillow, the blanket, the quiet architecture of the place where you have chosen to lie tonight. The day is behind you now, every demand it made, every noise it carried, and the night has come in its place. And the night asks nothing of you at all. You need not move, you need not decide, you need only listen, and even that is optional, for the story will carry itself forward, whether you follow every word, or let some of them drift past you the way snow drifts past a window, softly, without consequence. The smell of coal smoke hung in the cold air outside, mingling with the particular metallic sweetness of frost on iron railings, and the distant, almost imagined scent of roasting chestnuts from a vendor who had long since packed his cart and gone home. Closer, much closer. The warmth of a well-kept fire pressed against the glass of a first-floor window, and behind that glass, the sitting room at 221B Baker Street glowed with the amber certainty of a place that had been lived in so thoroughly it had become, in its own quiet way, alive. And it is into just such an evening, a quiet one, a kind one, that we step now, through a familiar door, up a familiar stair, into the sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The sitting room at dusk. The room held its warmth the way old rooms do, not evenly, but in pockets and layers, so that the air nearest the hearth was almost too warm for comfort, while the corners held a pleasant coolness, and the space between the two chairs before the fire existed in a state of perfect equilibrium, as if the room itself had long ago decided that this was the spot worth keeping temperate. The fire had been built up around 4 o'clock by Mrs. Hudson, who understood, with the instinct of a woman who had kept lodgers for the better part of 2 decades, that a fire begun in the afternoon would be at its most companionable by evening, not roaring, not failing, but settled into the deep, steady burn of well-seasoned oak, the kind that crackled only occasionally, and then with a sound more like conversation than complaint. Upon the mantelpiece, between a small stack of unanswered correspondence and a tobacco-filled Persian slipper that no foot had ever worn, the clock ticked with the regularity of a man who has kept the same appointment every day for 30 years. Its face was slightly yellowed. Its hands moved at a pace that suggested it was in no hurry to bring the next hour, nor particularly sorry to see the last one go. Beside it, a magnifying glass lay on its side, catching the firelight along one curved edge and sending a thin line of amber across the spines of the books shelved behind it, chemistry mostly, and monographs, and one battered volume of Petrarch that had been there so long it had become invisible to everyone except Mrs. Hudson, who dusted it on Thursdays. Dr. John Watson sat in the left-hand chair, the one nearer the door, with a medical journal open across his knee and a pencil held loosely between his fingers. He had not turned a page in some time. The warmth had done its work on him, and his reading had become the particular kind that happens when the body is comfortable and the mind is willing to be led, words entering the eye but traveling no further than the surface, like rain on a well-oiled coat. His tea sat on the small table beside him, still faintly steaming, the cup a deep brown china that Mrs. Hudson had chosen for its ability to hold heat, and the smell of bergamot rose from it in a thin, curling thread that mixed with the coal smoke and the beeswax polish she had applied to the side table only that morning. Holmes stood at the window, his tall, lean figure silhouetted against the frost-patterned glass, watching Baker Street receive its snow with the expression of a man who was either thinking very deeply or not thinking at all. And with Holmes, Watson had learned, the two states were more similar than one might suppose. His dressing gown, the mouse-colored one he favored in the colder months, hung from his angular frame with the resigned elegance of a flag on a windless day. His pipe was unlit, held in his right hand, forgotten for the moment in favor of whatever the snow was telling him. The gaslight from the street below lit the underside of his jaw and the sharp line of his cheekbone, and beyond him, through the glass, the city lay white and muffled and still. Neither man spoke, neither needed to. The room spoke for them, in the tick of the clock and the settling of the fire, and the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who have shared enough evenings that the absence of words has become its own kind of language, fluent and warm. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps could be heard upon the stair, and with them came the faint rattle of a tea tray, and the warm scent of something freshly baked, and something else, too, the evening post. The evening post arrives. She appeared in the doorway, with the tray balanced against one hip, a woman of comfortable middle age whose face held the permanent expression of someone who had seen a great deal and decided, on balance, to remain fond of the world regardless. The tray bore a fresh pot beneath a knitted cozy, a plate of seed cake cut into generous slices, and a small stack of letters held together with a thin band of brown paper. The scent of the cake, warm butter and caraway, entered the room ahead of her like an advance party, and Watson, stirring in his chair, felt the particular gratitude that comes from being fed without having asked. The post was late again, Mrs. Hudson said, setting the tray on the side table with the practiced efficiency of a woman who could navigate the cluttered geography of 221B with her eyes closed. And the boy who brings it had snow in his boots up to the ankle, poor thing. I gave him a cup of broth before he went on. She straightened, pressed her hands flat against her apron, and regarded Holmes, who had not turned from the window. There's seed cake, Mr. Holmes, and I'll not hear about it tomorrow that it went stale because you were too busy watching the weather. Holmes turned at last, and the faint warmth of a smile, or what passed for a smile in a face built more for precision than sentiment, crossed his features. Mrs. Hudson, you are a fixed point in an uncertain world. I am a landlady, she replied, and left them to it. Watson poured the tea, the familiar ceremony of lifting the cozy, tilting the pot, the sound of liquid meeting china, the curl of steam rising between them like a shared breath. He passed a cup to Holmes, who accepted it with a nod and set it on the mantelpiece while he turned his attention to the post. Most of the letters were unremarkable. A bill from the chemist, a circular from a locksmith, a note from Lestrade, which Holmes read and discarded with a single raised eyebrow that told Watson everything and nothing. But at the bottom of the pile lay a single envelope that was none of these things. It was cream-colored, of heavy stock, and bore no stamp. It had been hand-delivered. Holmes's name was written across its face in a careful, unfamiliar copperplate, the kind of handwriting that suggested education, patience, and the particular steadiness of a hand accustomed to fine and detailed work. The envelope was heavier than a single sheet of paper could account for. Something stiff lay inside it, something that did not bend when Holmes pressed the edge between his thumb and forefinger. The fire crackled once, softly, as if clearing its throat. Holmes turned the envelope slowly in his long fingers, and Watson, setting down his cup, felt the room grow just a shade quieter, as though the fire itself were listening. Chapter 2. The Heart of the Setting. The letter knife lay on the mantelpiece beside the unanswered correspondence, a slim instrument of brass and bone that Holmes had acquired from an estate sale in Kensington some years prior, and which he favored, Watson suspected, less for its utility than for the satisfying weight of it in his hand. He took it up now with the same unhurried deliberation with which he did all things that interested him, and slid the blade beneath the sealed flap of the envelope with a single clean motion. The paper parted without resistance, and the room seemed to hold its breath, though that, Watson would later concede, may have been only his own. From inside the envelope, Holmes withdrew a single object, a photograph, mounted on stiff card of the kind used by professional portrait studios, its edges clean and square, its surface carrying the faint silver sheen of albumen printing. The image was perhaps 6 inches by 4, and it had been developed with a clarity and tonal range that spoke of considerable skill, the blacks deep and true, the grays layered with the delicacy of watercolor, the whites crisp as the snow still falling beyond the window. Watson leaned forward in his chair, drawn by the instinct of a man who had spent enough years beside Holmes to recognize when something ordinary had quietly become something else. The photograph depicted a funeral. It was composed with the formality of a studio portrait, yet it showed an outdoor scene, a chapel of gray stone, a path lined with dark-coated mourners, a coffin resting upon a bier draped in black cloth. Bare winter trees stood in the background, their branches etched against a pale sky. The mourners stood in attitudes of grief, heads bowed, hands clasped, faces partially visible beneath the brims of hats and the edges of veils. The quality of the image was extraordinary. Every detail was precise, every shadow intentional, as if the photographer had not merely captured the scene, but composed it, the way a painter composes a canvas, with absolute command over what was seen and what was left in darkness. Holmes tilted the photograph toward the gaslight, and the amber glow moved across its surface like a hand passing over water. Watson drew his chair closer still, and the leather creaked beneath him, and the fire shifted in the grate with a sound like a slow exhalation, and the clock on the mantelpiece continued its steady, unhurried count. It was Watson who noticed it first, the name upon the headstone just visible in the background of the image, rendered in a mason's careful hand. The impossible image. Holmes, Watson said, and the word came out quieter than he had intended, as though the room's hush had entered his voice without permission. That headstone. Can you make out the inscription? Holmes lifted the magnifying glass from beside the clock and held it over the photograph, his eyes settling behind the lens with the focused patience of a jeweler examining a stone. He said nothing for several seconds. The fire ticked. The snow whispered against the glass. Watson could feel the warmth of the hearth along one side of his face, steady and constant, even as something less definable moved through the room. Not cold precisely, but the kind of stillness that arrives when the world pauses to make room for something unexpected. "The name," Holmes said at last, and his voice held not alarm, but a quality Watson had learned to recognize as the particular brightness that kindled in him when a problem arrived worthy of his attention, "is mine." Watson took the magnifying glass when it was offered and brought the headstone into focus. The letters were small but unmistakable, carved into the granite with a precision that left no room for misreading. Sherlock Holmes. Beneath the name, 2 dates. The first, Holmes's year of birth, rendered correctly. The second, a date of death. Watson read it twice and felt the warmth of the tea he had drunk moments ago turn to something heavier in his chest. The date of death was 3 days from now. Tucked behind the photograph, held in place by the stiffness of the mounting card, was a small memorial card of the kind distributed at funerals, cream-colored, bordered in black, printed with the same name and the same dates. Beneath the dates, in italic typeface, a verse had been set. "I hold it true, whate'er befall. I feel it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." Tennyson. Watson recognized it at once, in memoriam, a poem written not in anger but in grief, not for an enemy, but for a friend dearly loved and dearly lost. It was, Watson thought, an odd choice for a threat, a very odd choice indeed. He looked up from the card and found Holmes watching him, and in his friend's gray eyes there was no trace of fear, only the quiet, steady light of a mind that had been offered a locked door and was already, with something very close to pleasure, reaching for its picks. Holmes set down the magnifying glass and reached, quite unhurriedly, for his tea, and Watson, though his heart had not entirely settled, did the same. Holmes's first observations. The tea had cooled just enough to drink comfortably, and Holmes held the cup in both hands as he spoke, the steam rising between his fingers and dissolving into the warm air of the sitting room. Watson had seen this posture 100 times, the held cup, the lowered eyes, the voice that moved at the pace of a man laying out cards on a table, one by one, face up, each one placed with the certainty of someone who already knows the order of the deck, even if he does not yet know the game. "The paper stock is continental," Holmes began, turning the photograph over to examine its reverse. "German, I should say, or possibly Swiss. It has the weight and texture of Schleicher and Schull's best albumen stock, not easily obtained in London, though not impossible if one knows the right supplier. The mounting card is English, however, and of recent manufacture. The adhesive is fresh. This photograph was printed and mounted within the last week." He paused and lifted the card to his nose, inhaling with the delicacy of a sommelier. "Collodion, silver nitrate, and something else, hypo, of course, for the fixing bath, but beneath it a trace of lavender oil, an unusual addition. Some photographers add it to their final rinse to prevent foxing, a habit rather than a necessity, a signature of sorts." Watson listened, and the fire listened, and the clock on the mantelpiece marked each observation with its steady accompaniment. And outside the window, the snow continued to fall in the soft, unhurried manner of something that would still be falling long after this conversation was done. "The faces," Holmes continued, setting down his cup and lifting the magnifying glass once more. "Look here, Watson. The mourners. This woman in the veil, her posture, the angle of her shoulders, the way she holds her handkerchief. That is Mrs. Hudson. I would know her silhouette in a crowd of 1,000. And here, this figure in the gray overcoat leaning on a stick. That is you, my dear fellow." Watson felt a strange, cold weight settle in his stomach, as though he had swallowed a stone. But the fire was warm, and Holmes's voice was steady, and the room held them both in its amber light, and the feeling passed as such feelings do, not vanishing, but moving to the edges where it could be observed rather than obeyed. "Lestrade is here as well, near the chapel door, and this large figure standing apart from the others, beneath the yew tree, that is unmistakably Mycroft. Holmes set down the glass and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in the familiar cathedral of thought. Every face in this photograph is someone known to me. Every detail is accurate. My brother's preferred overcoat, Mrs. Hudson's mourning veil from the Abernathy funeral 2 years ago, your service stick, which you carry only in cold weather when your leg troubles you. Whoever created this image had access not merely to our likenesses, but to the intimate particulars of our habits and possessions. He paused, and the coal shifted in the grate, and a small cascade of embers fell through the iron bars with a sound like distant applause. "It is a composite," Holmes said, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man who has found the seam in what was meant to appear seamless. "A masterwork of composite photography, multiple negatives layered and printed as one. The chapel is real, Highgate if I am not mistaken, the older section near the Lebanon cedar, but the mourners have been placed into the scene from separate portraits, and the coffin is almost certainly a studio prop. The technical skill required to produce this is extraordinary. In all of England, I can think of no more than 2 people capable of it." And so the question hung between them, gentle as pipe smoke drifting toward the ceiling. Not who had died, for Holmes was very much alive, but who had gone to such extraordinary lengths to imagine that he wasn't. The night deepens, direct address. Beyond the window, Baker Street had surrendered entirely to the snow. The pavement, the railings, the narrow stone steps of each terraced house, all had been softened into the same unbroken white, so that the street looked less like a thoroughfare and more like a page waiting to be written upon. A single handsome cab passed below, its lamp a wavering point of gold, the horse's hooves muffled to a rhythm that was felt more than heard. A slow, padded heartbeat moving through the fog, growing fainter, then gone. The gas lamps stood at intervals along the pavement, each one wrapped in its own haze of frozen light, and between them the darkness was not menacing but full, the way a deep drawer is full, holding everything inside it gently without urgency. The mantel clock struck the half-hour, a single chime that traveled across the sitting room and settled into the corners like a cat finding a warm spot. Watson felt the sound in his chest more than in his ears. It was a kind sound, a patient one. It asked for nothing. And you, wherever you are tonight, in whatever room, in whatever country, beneath whatever weight of blanket or worry or weariness, you are here too, in this story, as surely as Watson is in his chair and Holmes is at his window. The night outside your own walls may be cold or warm, still or restless, but here, in this place we have made together, the fire is banked and the snow is falling, and there is no clock that matters except the one on the mantelpiece, and it is in no hurry at all. Let your breathing match its pace if you like. Let the story carry you. There is time enough for everything, and nothing that cannot wait. Holmes stood at the window a while longer, his reflection ghosted in the frost-patterned glass, and Watson watched him from the warmth of his chair, and felt, as he so often did in these moments, the particular comfort of knowing that whatever puzzle the night had brought, it had brought it to the right door. The photograph lay on the table between them, its surface catching the firelight, the faces of mourners who had not yet mourned, looking up from the albumen paper, with expressions of a grief that had not yet been felt, and, if Holmes had anything to say about the matter, never would be. By the time Holmes rose from his chair and reached for his coat, the snow had thickened and the clock had struck 9, and Watson knew, as he always did, that the game had quietly, irresistibly begun. Chapter 3. The Disturbance. The staircase at 221B had its own vocabulary of sound, and Watson knew every word. The third step from the top creaked in a register slightly higher than the others, a soprano among altos, and the banister rail hummed faintly beneath his gloved hand as he descended, the vibration of old wood responding to the cold that had crept in through the front door's imperfect seal. Mrs. Hudson had left a lamp burning in the vestibule, as she always did when she suspected her lodgers would be going out, and its flame bent in the draught from the door with the gentle attentiveness of someone bowing to greet a guest. Holmes was already at the bottom, wrapping his scarf, the gray cashmere one, Watson noted, which he wore only in the deepest cold, around his throat with the efficient motions of a man who considered dressing for the weather a necessary concession to mortality rather than a pleasure. His ulster coat hung from his shoulders to his ankles, and his deerstalker cap sat slightly askew, as it always did, because Holmes had never in his life placed a hat on his head and then checked a looking-glass to see if it was straight. They stepped outside together, and the night received them with the particular generosity of a London winter that has decided to be beautiful rather than merely cold. The snow fell in flakes so large and slow they seemed less like weather and more like a decision the sky had made, to be gentle tonight, to lay down its white cloth and soften every edge. Baker Street stretched before them in both directions, luminous with gaslight and silence, the footprints of earlier passers-by already half-filled, the air carrying that extraordinary quiet that deep snow brings, as though the city had been wrapped in cotton wool and told to sleep. Watson drew a breath of the night air and felt it move through him, cold, clean, carrying the faint mineral sharpness of frost, and beneath it the familiar bass note of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys. It tasted, he thought, the way January is supposed to taste but so rarely does, crisp and honest, and carrying within its chill the quiet promise that somewhere, not far from here, something warm was waiting. A handsome cab appeared from the direction of Regent's Park, its lamp swinging gently with the motion of the horse. The driver hunched on his perch with a blanket across his knees and his collar turned up to his ears. Holmes raised a hand and the cab drew to a halt. The horse's breath rising in twin plumes of white, its hooves shifting on the snow with a muffled, patient sound. They climbed inside, and the cab's interior closed around them with the particular intimacy of a small, enclosed space in winter. The smell of old leather, the residual warmth of previous passengers, the slight sway as the horse moved forward, and the wheels found their grip on the whitened cobblestones. Watson settled into his seat and felt the motion take hold of him, that gentle rocking that belongs to horse-drawn travel and to very little else, a rhythm older than any engine, slower than any train, the kind of movement the body trusts without being asked. "Bloomsbury," Holmes said to the driver through the small hatch above them, and the word was nearly swallowed by the snow. "Great Russell Street, the bookshop with the blue door." The cab turned south along Portland Place, and the city unfolded around them in soft, snow-muted layers. And Holmes, his collar turned up, began to speak of a man who could make the impossible visible. "Aldrich Voss," Holmes said, and the name arrived in the cab like a guest settling into a chair, unhurried and comfortable, "is perhaps the finest photographic artist in England, though he would never use the word artist himself. He prefers craftsman, and in that preference you may understand the whole of the man. He is 73 years old, half blind in his left eye, and has not left his studio above the bookshop on Great Russell Street in, if my information is correct, nearly 14 months. His world has contracted to 2 rooms, a dark room, and the company of several thousand glass negatives, and by all accounts, he is perfectly content with the arrangement." The cab rocked gently as it turned the corner, and Watson felt the motion in his spine, a slow pendulum swing that moved through the seat and into his body with the insistence of a tide. The leather creaked beneath him. Outside, the snow continued its silent work, covering the city in its unhurried way, and the gas lamps of Portland Place moved past the window one by one, each a brief warm pulse against the cold glass, before sliding away into the dark. "Voss's particular gift," Holmes continued, his voice pitched just above the sound of the hooves and the wheels, "is composite photography, the art of combining multiple negatives into a single print so seamlessly that the eye cannot detect the join. A portrait of a family gathered in a drawing room, though each member was photographed on a different day. A landscape that places a summer sky above a winter field. In the hands of a lesser practitioner, the results are crude: mismatched light, soft edges, the telltale haze where one image surrenders to another. In the hands of Voss, the result is indistinguishable from a photograph taken of a real scene. He does not merely combine images, he composes realities. Watson considered this as the cab passed the shuttered facade of a milliner's shop, its window display just visible through the frost, a row of hats on wooden stands, watching the snow like a silent audience. The smell of the cab's leather had mixed with the cold air leaking in around the door, and the combination was not unpleasant. It had the character of a London winter night, layered and particular, belonging to no other city and no other season. Some years ago, Holmes said, Voss produced a commission that became briefly famous in certain circles. A widow in Belgravia had lost her husband to a fever while he was abroad. There was no photograph of them together. They had married late, and the daguerreotype they had planned to sit for was delayed, and delayed again, and then it was too late. Voss created one. A portrait of the woman dancing with her husband in the parlor of their home. He in his evening dress, and she in hers. The light from the chandelier falling across them both with perfect consistency. Half of London society believed it was genuine. The widow kept it on her mantelpiece until the day she died. Voss never spoke of it publicly. He considered it a kindness, not a deception. The cab had reached Bloomsbury now, and the streets narrowed and grew quieter, the snow lying thicker where fewer wheels had passed. Watson could hear the horses breathing, steady and deep, and the faint jingle of the harness, and beneath both of these the great hush of a city at rest. Voss had one apprentice, Holmes said, and his voice shifted, not in volume but in register, the way a cellist moves from one string to another without lifting the bow. A young woman of exceptional talent named Elara Finch. She came to him at 19, studied under him for 4 years, and surpassed him in technical skill before she was 23. Voss has said, privately to those he trusts, that her ability to match light across composited negatives was the finest he had ever seen, including his own. She left his studio 2 years ago, quite abruptly, and vanished from the profession entirely. Voss does not know where she went. He does not speak of her without sadness. Watson filed the name away. Elara Finch, a woman who could make the impossible look real and who had disappeared. The cab slowed, and through the frosted window, Watson could make out a narrow shop front on Great Russell Street, its upper windows dark save for one, where a faint amber light flickered like a candle that had been burning a long time. The studio of Aldrich Voss. The bookshop below was closed and dark, its window displaying an arrangement of leather-bound volumes and a handwritten card that read, "Back tomorrow," in letters that suggested the shopkeeper had been writing the same card for many tomorrows. A side door, painted blue and slightly warped by weather, opened onto a staircase so narrow that Holmes and Watson were obliged to ascend in single file, their shoulders brushing the plaster walls on either side. The stairs smelled of old paper and damp stone, and something sharper beneath, the faint, acrid sweetness of photographic chemicals that had seeped into the woodwork over decades and become as much a part of the building as the mortar between its bricks. Each step creaked under Watson's boots, and the sound was companionable rather than ominous, the voice of a staircase that had welcomed many visitors and bore them no ill will. At the top, a door stood slightly ajar, and the amber light they had seen from the street fell through the gap in a warm, narrow band that lay across the landing floor like a welcome mat made of gold. Holmes knocked twice, lightly with the backs of his knuckles, and from within came a voice that was thin and clear, and carried the slight waver of advanced age, like a violin string that has been tuned so many times it has learned to sing even at rest. "It is open, whoever you are, and if you have come to sell me something, I will be deeply disappointed in you." Holmes pushed the door wide, and the studio of Aldrich Voss revealed itself to Watson like a cabinet of wonders opened by a patient hand. The room was large but made intimate by the sheer density of objects it contained. Glass negatives were stacked in wooden racks along one wall, hundreds of them, each one a captured moment held in silver and shadow, their edges catching the lamplight in thin, bright lines. Bottles of chemicals lined a shelf above a long workbench: silver nitrate, potassium cyanide, albumin, collodion. Their labels handwritten in a precise script that was fading now to the color of old tea. A bellows camera stood in one corner on a heavy tripod, its brass fittings polished to a soft glow, its leather bellows cracked but still supple, like the hide of an animal that had aged with dignity. Dried flowers hung in bunches from the ceiling beams, lavender and chamomile and something Watson did not recognize, and their scent had settled into the room's atmosphere so thoroughly that it was no longer a smell but a quality of the air itself, herbaceous and sweet and faintly dusty. Voss sat in a deep armchair beside a small cast-iron stove that radiated heat, with the quiet determination of something that had been asked to do one job and intended to do it well. He was a small man, made smaller by the shawl that wrapped his shoulders and the blanket that covered his knees, with white hair that rose from his head in a corona of fine, disordered strands, as if he had recently been in conversation with an electrical apparatus. His eyes were bright behind spectacles of unusual thickness, and his hands, when he reached out to greet them, were steady, the fingers long and stained with silver nitrate in patterns that looked, Watson thought, rather like the maps of unknown countries. "Mr. Holmes," Voss said, and his voice held the warmth of recognition without surprise. "I have been wondering when you would come. Not about this specifically. I simply assumed that one day something would bring you up my stairs, and I resolved long ago to have mulled wine ready when it did." He gestured toward a pot that sat on top of the stove, its surface giving off a thin thread of steam that smelled of cloves and cinnamon and red wine. And Watson felt, despite the strangeness of the evening, a wave of gratitude for the simple existence of warm things in cold rooms. They accepted the wine. They sat, and Holmes produced the photograph. Voss took it in both hands and held it beneath the lamp, and the room grew quiet in the way that rooms do when someone is looking at something that matters. His bright eyes moved across the image slowly, with the attention of a man who was not merely seeing, but reading, the light, the composition, the grain of the paper, the depth of the blacks, the precision of the joins where one negative met another. His lips moved faintly, as though he were having a conversation with the photograph itself, too private for others to hear. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The warmth was still there, but it had been joined by something else, a recognition that went beyond the image itself and reached into the craft behind it, the way a musician recognizes another musician's hand in a piece of work before a single note is attributed. "This is composite printing," Voss said, his voice quiet now, almost reverent. "And it is masterful. The light matching alone. Do you see here the way the shadow falls across the chapel wall and continues without interruption across the mourners in the foreground? That requires not merely skill, but an understanding of light that borders on the intuitive. I know of only 2 people in England who could produce this." He paused, and the stove ticked, and the dried lavender trembled faintly in a draught from the window. "Myself, and Alara Finch." Voss set down the photograph very gently, as one might set down a letter from someone long missed, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, touched, Watson thought, by something close to sorrow. "Alara came to me when she was 19, Voss said, and his hands settled on the blanket across his knees in the manner of a man who has told a story before and knows where the difficult parts are. She had no formal training, but she had something no training can provide. An eye that understood the way light behaves when it passes through glass and silver and time. I taught her everything I knew. The emulsions, the exposure calculations, the art of masking one negative against another so that the seam vanishes entirely. She learned in months what took me years. She was, without exaggeration, the most gifted student I have ever known. The mulled wine was warm in Watson's hands, and the scent of cloves rose from the cup and mingled with the dried lavender overhead, and the stove continued its patient work of keeping the room at the precise temperature where comfort becomes something you forget to notice, because it is so complete. She left 2 years ago, Voss continued. Quite without warning, I came to the studio one morning and found her workbench cleared, her negatives packed, and a note that said only that she could not continue. I learned later, through a mutual acquaintance, that her younger brother Thomas had died. A fever, they said, very sudden. The boy was 14. Voss removed his spectacles and polished them on the edge of his shawl, and Watson saw that his eyes, without the glass between them and the world, were the pale, washed blue of a winter sky. Elara had raised Thomas herself after their parents died. She was everything to him. He was everything to her. When he died, the light went out of her, and for a woman whose entire gift depended on her understanding of light, that was a kind of double loss that I cannot adequately describe. Holmes listened without interruption, his untouched wine cooling in his hands, his gray eyes resting on Voss with an attention so complete it seemed almost physical, as though his gaze had weight and warmth. "I do not know where she went," Voss said. "I have written to her. The letters come back." He paused, and the stove ticked, and the glass negatives along the wall caught the lamplight in their edges and held it. "But I should tell you, Mr. Holmes, there is another man you may wish to speak with. His name is Cornelius Dreyer. He is a collector of memorial photography, what some call memento mori, photographs of the dead. He has, over the years, commissioned composite work of this precise nature, images that place the living alongside the deceased, or that fabricate funeral scenes for those who wish to contemplate their own mortality. A peculiar hobby, perhaps, but he pays well, and his interest, as far as I have ever been able to determine, is sincere rather than sinister." Watson wrote the name in his pocketbook. Cornelius Dreyer. The pencil moved across the page with a small scratching sound, and the fire inside the stove settled with a murmur, and the room held all of them. Holmes, Watson, Voss, the memory of Elara, the memory of Thomas, in its warm and cluttered embrace. And you may rest here, too, for a moment, in this room above the bookshop, where the chemicals have stained the wood, and the lavender hangs from the beams, and the old man in the shawl has made mulled wine for visitors he was not expecting, but is glad all the same to have received. The night is still young, the fire still burns. There is nowhere you need to be but here. They left Voss warming his hands by his small stove, the amber light from his window following them down the stair like a kind thought, and stepped once more into the snow, where the city waited, patient and white. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. The cab ride home was quieter than the one out. Holmes sat with his chin sunk into his scarf and his eyes half closed, and Watson, who had long ago learned to distinguish between Holmes's contemplative silences and his dismissive ones, recognized this as the former, a mind at work behind a face at rest, the way a mill wheel turns steadily beneath a still pond. The city passed the frosted windows of the cab in a procession of soft impressions. A row of shuttered shops on Gower Street, their awnings weighted with snow. A solitary policeman walking his beat beneath an umbrella that seemed, against the white sky, more ceremonial than practical. A church spire rising above the rooftops like a finger pressed gently to the lips of the night, asking for silence and receiving it. They arrived at Baker Street to find the door unlocked and the vestibule lamp still burning, and the staircase welcomed them back with its familiar vocabulary of creaks and sighs. The sitting room above was exactly as they had left it, but warmer. Mrs. Hudson had been up in their absence, and the fire had been rebuilt, and a fresh pot of tea sat beneath the knitted cozy on the side table, still hot enough that the first touch of Watson's hand against the pot told him it had been placed there no more than 10 minutes ago. She had known somehow, as she always did, approximately when they would return, and had timed the tea accordingly. It was, Watson reflected, the kind of small, uncelebrated act of care that made a house into a home and a landlady into something closer to family. He hung their coats on the stand by the door, arranging them near enough to the fire that the damp wool would dry by morning, but not so near that the heat would damage the fabric, a piece of domestic knowledge so deeply embedded in his habits that he performed it without thought, the way the body breathes, the way the heart remembers to beat. The coats released their smell as they warmed, wet wool and cold air and the lingering trace of Voss's studio, cloves and lavender and the faint chemical sharpness of silver nitrate. Watson poured 2 cups of tea. The sound of liquid meeting china was, in this room, as familiar as the ticking of the clock, as constant as the coals in the grate, and he performed the ritual with the reverence it deserved. Pot lifted, stream steady, cup turned so that the handle faced the drinker's hand, saucer placed beneath with a faint chime of porcelain meeting porcelain. He set Holmes's cup on the arm of his chair and carried his own to the left-hand seat, and the leather received him with the particular sigh of a chair that has held the same body so many times it has learned its shape. The clock ticked. The fire murmured. The tea steamed. The snow pressed against the window panes in soft, accumulating silence. And Watson felt, with the whole of his body, the relief of homecoming, not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a loosening of the muscles across his shoulders, a deepening of his breath, a warmth that began in his hands where they held the cup and radiated outward until it reached the furthest margins of his awareness and settled there, gentle and complete. Holmes struck a match, and the small flame lit his features for a moment before the pipe caught. And in that brief glow, Watson saw the familiar look of a mind beginning to sort its evidence. Holmes thinks aloud. "Let us consider what we know," Holmes said, and the pipe smoke rose from the bowl in a thin blue thread that climbed toward the ceiling and dissolved into the warm air above the fire, joining the general atmosphere of the room in the same effortless way a brook joins a river. "We have a photograph depicting my funeral, produced by composite printing of the highest order. The paper is continental. The mounting is English. The faces are those of people known to me, not public figures whose likenesses could be obtained from any newspaper, but private individuals photographed with an intimacy that suggests long observation or personal access." He drew on the pipe, and the bowl glowed orange for a moment, a small, warm planet held between his fingers. The tobacco scent reached Watson a moment later, the particular blend Holmes favored, dark and slightly sweet, with an undertone of cherry wood that Watson associated so strongly with this room and this chair and this hour of the evening that he sometimes caught the ghost of it in other places and felt, inexplicably, safe. "Voss we may set aside," Holmes continued. "His eyesight alone would prevent him from work of this precision, and more to the point, his character does not admit of it. A man who makes mulled wine for unexpected visitors at 10 o'clock at night is not a man who sends anonymous photographs of funerals. No, the craft is a Lara Finch's. Of that I am as certain as I am of the periodic table." Watson sipped his tea and felt the warmth of it trace a line from his throat to his chest, and the bergamot reached his nose a moment later, and the fire shifted in the grate with the low, conversational sound of coals rearranging themselves for the next hour. "What interests me," Holmes said, and now his voice dropped half a register, "is the memorial card, the verse. Watson, you recognized it? Tennyson, In Memoriam, a poem written in the aftermath of Arthur Hallam's death. Not a poem of vengeance, not a poem of threat. A poem of grief so deep and so sustained that it took 17 years to complete. He reached for the card, which lay on the table between them, and read the verse again, softly, as though the words were something fragile that might break if handled too firmly. "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. These are not the words of someone who wishes me harm, Watson. These are the words of someone who is in pain." The verse lingered in the room like the last note of the violin, present even after the sound had stopped, felt in the chest rather than heard by the ear. Watson turned the words over in his mind. A funeral photograph, composed with extraordinary skill and sent anonymously, accompanied by a poem of grief rather than a declaration of enmity. It did not fit the shape of a threat. It fit the shape of something else, something sadder and perhaps more complicated, and Watson was not yet certain what to call it. Cornelius Dreer remains a possibility, Holmes conceded, settling deeper into his chair. He has the resources, and his fascination with death photography provides a plausible motive. We shall visit him in the morning. But I confess, Watson, that I keep returning to the verse and to what Voss told us of Alara Finch, a woman who lost her brother, who blamed herself, who disappeared, a woman who could make the impossible appear real. He drew on his pipe once more, and the smoke rose and the clock ticked, and the snow pressed its soft weight against the glass. The verse lingered in the room like a held breath. Tender words, Watson thought, for what was meant to be a threat. And Holmes, too, seemed to feel their weight, for he sat very still for a long while after. The morning visit to Cornelius Dreer. Morning arrived the way winter mornings do in London, not all at once, but in increments, the darkness thinning by degrees, until the sky above Baker Street achieved a pale, luminous gray that was not quite daylight, but was no longer night, a color that existed only in January, and only in cities where the chimneys outnumber the trees. Watson woke in his chair, where he had fallen asleep sometime after midnight with his journal open on his knee, and found that someone, Holmes or Mrs. Hudson, he could not tell, had laid a blanket over him while he slept. The fire had been rebuilt, the tea was fresh, the clock had continued its faithful work through the night, and now informed him, with its usual quiet authority, that it was 8:30. Holmes was already dressed, already sharp, already in possession of information that Watson did not yet have, which was the natural order of mornings at 221B, and had been for as long as Watson could remember. A cab was called. Toast was consumed. The cold air outside greeted them with the particular brightness that follows a night of heavy snow. The sky scrubbed clean and the rooftops gleaming, and the cab carried them south and west toward Belgravia, where the houses grew larger and the silence grew deeper, and the wealth announced itself not through ostentation, but through the quality of the silence, the thickness of the curtains, the depth of the carpets, the particular hush of streets where people paid a great deal of money for the privilege of hearing nothing at all. Cornelius Dreer's townhouse occupied a corner of a quiet square, its facade the color of old cream, its windows tall and draped in velvet of a blue so dark it was nearly black. The door was opened by a valet of such rigorous composure that Watson suspected the man had been trained not merely in domestic service, but in some form of meditative discipline, and they were shown into a parlor that was warm, over-furnished, and quite unlike any room Watson had visited before. The walls were covered in photographs, dozens of them, in gilded frames of every size, arranged with the care and density of a gallery exhibition, and every photograph depicted the dead. Here, a child lying in a crib, eyes closed, surrounded by flowers, the image so delicate and so tender that Watson had to look twice before he understood what he was seeing. There, a woman seated in a chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene, dressed in her finest gown for the occasion of her own memorial portrait. Beside her, a husband and wife photographed together, he living, she not, his hand resting on her shoulder with a gentleness that suggested he had not yet fully accepted that she could no longer feel it. The room smelled of beeswax and dried lavender, and the particular stillness of old photographs. A smell Watson could not have named, but recognized at once. The smell of time, held in silver and paper and glass. Dreer himself rose from a writing desk by the window as they entered, a thin man of perhaps 55 with a nervous energy that expressed itself in the constant motion of his hands, straightening his cuffs, adjusting his spectacles, touching the edge of a frame as he passed it, as though reassuring himself that his collection was still there. His face was narrow and intelligent, his eyes quick, his smile genuine but slightly anxious, the smile of a man who is accustomed to being misunderstood and has learned to expect it. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, this is an unexpected pleasure, though I confess that unexpected pleasures tend to make me more nervous than expected ones. He gestured toward two armchairs beside a marble fireplace, where a coal fire burned with the steady, unfussy warmth of a fire that was tended by staff and never allowed to falter. Please, sit. I'll have coffee brought. The coffee, when it arrived, was excellent, dark, strong, slightly bitter, served in china so thin Watson could see the shadow of his fingers through the cup. Holmes produced the funeral photograph and laid it on the table between them, and Dreer looked at it with the eyes of a man who collected such images, the way others collected paintings or stamps or first editions, with knowledge, with discrimination, and with a reverence that Watson found, to his surprise, more moving than unsettling. Remarkable, Dreer murmured, turning the photograph toward the light. The tonal range, the precision of the compositing. This is not merely good work, Mr. Holmes. This is art. He looked up, and his expression carried neither guilt nor evasion, only the uncomplicated admiration of a connoisseur. But I did not commission it, and I do not know who did. I can tell you that the technique is consistent with the work of a young woman who catalogued my collection briefly, Alara Finch. She was with me for 3 months, perhaps 4, and during that time she handled every photograph in this room with a care and attention that I have rarely seen equaled. She understood these images, Mr. Holmes. She understood that they are not morbid. They are acts of love. Portraits taken so that the living might hold the dead a little longer. He paused and looked around his parlor, at the quiet faces in their gilded frames, and Watson saw in his expression something he had not expected to find in a collector of death, a tenderness so complete and so unguarded that it amounted to vulnerability. She was grieving, Dreer said, deeply, for her brother. She spoke of him very little, but when she did, there was a quality in her voice, a kind of controlled desolation that I recognized because I have heard it before, in my own voice, after my wife died. She became convinced, I think, that photographs could do something more than preserve a likeness, that they could hold the essence of a person, that if the craft were fine enough and the intention pure enough, the image could become a kind of vessel. He shook his head, gently. I could not follow her there, but I understood the impulse. Dreer walked them to the door himself, and as the winter light caught the silver frames along his hallway, Watson felt not unease, but a kind of tender recognition that grief, even strange grief, was still grief. Watson reflects and direct address. The cab carried them back toward Baker Street, and Watson sat with his hands in his lap and his thoughts turning slowly, the way a weather vane turns when the wind has not yet decided on a direction. Outside the window, London was conducting its ordinary business. A flower seller arranging buckets of hothouse carnations outside a shop on Wigmore Street, her fingers red with cold. A postman leaning his bicycle against a railing while he sorted the morning's deliveries. A small dog trotting along the pavement with the purposeful air of an animal who knows exactly where it is going and considers the rest of the world a mild inconvenience. The city was alive and unhurried, and Watson felt its rhythm through the motion of the cab, steady as a pulse. He thought of Alara Finch, a young woman who had lost the person she loved most, and who had channeled that loss into the only language she possessed, the language of light and silver and glass. He thought of her hands, which Voss had described as the steadiest he had ever seen, and wondered whether they were steady still, or whether grief had found its way into them the way water finds its way into stone, slowly, invisibly, until the whole structure is changed. He thought of her letter, the one she had written to Holmes, the one that had never arrived. He wondered what it had said, whether it had been formal or desperate, whether she had written it in one sitting or over many days, whether she had posted it with hope or with the resigned certainty that hope was already a luxury she could not afford. The letter had vanished into the machinery of the postal system and been swallowed, and in its absence, a silence had grown that Alara had mistaken for indifference, and from that silence, this impossible photograph had been born. Holmes sat opposite him, watching London pass with the particular quality of attention that meant he was not seeing the streets at all, but rather some interior landscape of logic and inference that Watson could not access and would not, if he were honest, wish to, because Holmes's mind, for all its brilliance, was not always a comfortable place to live, and Watson preferred the warmer rooms of his own. And you, listening now, wherever the night has found you, let yourself be carried too. The cab is warm enough, the motion is gentle, the streets outside the window are soft with snow and morning light, and there is nothing you need to understand yet, nothing you need to solve. The story is being carried for you, the way the cab carries Watson, the way the night carries the city, the way your pillow carries the weight of your head. Let it hold you. You are doing beautifully. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. By the time they reached Baker Street, the afternoon light was already dimming, and upon the doorstep of 221B, waiting with snow in her hair and a letter in her hand, stood a young woman neither of them had ever seen before. Chapter 5. The Deepening Mystery. She was standing very still, and that was the first thing Watson noticed, the absolute stillness of her, as though she had been waiting so long that waiting had become a posture, a way of holding the body that was neither expectant nor resigned but something between the two. The particular patience of someone who has decided that this is where they will be, and whatever comes will come. Snow had settled on her shoulders and on the brim of her hat, and in the dark hair that had loosened from its pins and fallen in a single strand across her cheek. Her coat was thin for the season, the color of wet slate, and her boots, Watson observed, with the automatic assessment of a medical man, were soaked through at the seams. She had been standing in the snow for some time. Her hands were what Watson noticed second. She held a letter in her right hand, not gripping it, but holding it with the care one might give to a small and fragile animal. And her fingers, visible above the edges of fingerless gloves, were stained with dark marks that Watson recognized from Voss's studio. Silver nitrate, the indelible residue of the photographic trade, darkened by exposure to light, mapping her knuckles and the beds of her nails in patterns that would not wash away for weeks. Her left hand was bare, and the cold had turned it the color of marble, and she held it against her side as though she had forgotten it was there. She looked at them as the cab drew to a halt, and her eyes held neither challenge nor apology, only a weariness so profound that Watson felt it in his own chest, a sympathetic heaviness that arrived without invitation and settled itself beside his heart. She was young, 25 perhaps, or 26, but her eyes belonged to someone older, someone who had seen the shape that loss takes when it has lived in a body for a long time and begun to furnish the rooms behind the gaze. "Miss Finch?" Holmes said, and the name was spoken gently, without the sharpness of deduction, as though he were not identifying a suspect, but greeting someone who had been expected. She nodded. The snow fell around her in its slow, continuous way. Watson moved before thought could intervene. He took her arm, lightly, the way he might steady a patient who had been sitting too long and risen too quickly, and guided her toward the door. "You are frozen through," he said, And the words were not an observation but an action, because Watson had spent 30 years learning that the first treatment for any ailment, before diagnosis, before medicine, before questions, was warmth. They brought her upstairs. The sitting room received her as it received all who entered, with the steady glow of its fire, the tick of its clock, the familiar smell of coal and bergamot and beeswax that had become, for Watson, the scent of home itself. Holmes moved a chair closer to the hearth. Watson took her wet coat and hung it beside their own, where it began to steam faintly, releasing the smell of damp wool and cold air and something else, something fainter. Lavender, Watson thought, and remembered Voss's studio, and understood. Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway within minutes, as though she possessed some preternatural sense for the arrival of someone in need of tending. She carried a shawl, thick, soft, the color of heather, and she draped it over Ilara's shoulders without a word, the way one covers a sleeping child. And then she was gone, and back again with tea, and gone once more, and the room was warm, and the fire crackled, and Ilara Finch sat with a cup held in both hands, her ink-stained fingers wrapped around the china, and the color began, slowly, to return. When at last the color began to return to her cheeks, and the shivering stilled, Ilara Finch looked up at Holmes with eyes that were not afraid, only very, very tired, and began to speak. Ilara's story. "My brother's name was Thomas," she said, and her voice was low and even, the voice of someone who has rehearsed a story so many times that the telling of it has become a kind of ritual, each word worn smooth as river stone by repetition. Thomas Finch. He was 14 when he died. He had a fever. It came on very quickly, over the course of a single afternoon, and by the following morning he could not stand. I took him to the hospital on Gower Street. They said it was influenza. They gave him aspirin and told me to keep him warm and to wait. She paused, and the fire filled the silence with its low, familiar voice, and the clock continued its count, and the tea in her hands sent up a curl of steam that drifted toward the ceiling and joined the warmth already there. I waited 3 days. On the second day he seemed better. He sat up, he asked me to bring his sketchbook, he drew a goldfinch from memory because he could not see one from the window. On the third day the fever returned, worse than before, and by evening he was gone. Her voice did not break. It held steady, the way a bridge holds steady when the weight upon it has been there so long that the structure has absorbed it, has learned to carry it as part of its own architecture. He was all I had. Our parents died when I was 17. I raised him. I fed him. I taught him to read. I walked him to school every morning for 6 years. He was not my brother in the way that word is usually meant. He was my entire life. Watson listened, and the warmth of the fire touched his face, and the weight of her words touched something deeper, and he found himself thinking of things he had not thought of in some time. The particular heaviness of a loss that cannot be shared because there is no one left to share it with. The way grief in isolation becomes not smaller, but denser, compressing itself into something that occupies less space, but weighs immeasurably more. "I wrote to you, Mr. Holmes," Ilara said, and now she looked at him directly, and her eyes held something that was neither accusation nor supplication, but a quieter thing, a statement of fact that had been carried for 2 years and set down now at last upon the table of this warm room. "I believed that Thomas had been misdiagnosed. The symptoms did not match influenza. They were too sudden, too severe, and the brief recovery on the second day seemed to me inconsistent with what I had read. I am not a medical woman, but I am a careful observer. My profession demands it, and what I observed did not correspond to what I was told. I wrote to you because you are the person people write to when they have exhausted every other door. I asked for your help. I posted the letter myself from the post office on Great Russell Street, and I went home, and I waited. The fire crackled, and a coal split, and the two halves fell against each other with a soft, glowing sound, and the warmth of the room, held them all. No answer came, she said. Not that day, not that week, not in the month that followed. I wrote again. No answer. I concluded, and I ask you to understand how a grieving mind concludes, Mr. Holmes, because it does not conclude the way a well mind does. I concluded that you had received my letters and chosen not to respond, that my brother's death was too small a matter, that a boy of 14, from no family of consequence, with no wealth and no connections, was beneath your attention. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, the weariness in them had deepened. I was wrong. I know that now. But at the time, the only thing I could feel was rage, and the only language I had for rage was my craft. She paused, and the fire popped softly, and Watson noticed that the letter she still held in her lap was not the one she had written 2 years ago. It was something else entirely. The second letter and clue 3. I made the photograph over the course of 5 months, Alara said, and the steadiness in her voice had shifted now, not breaking but thinning, the way ice thins at the edges of a pond in early spring, still holding but no longer pretending to be solid. I gathered likenesses of each of you from public sources where I could, and from private observation where I could not. I followed Mrs. Hudson to the market. I sketched Dr. Watson from across the reading room at the British Library. I obtained a photograph of your brother from the records of the Diogenes Club through means that were not, I confess, entirely honorable. And I composited them all, every figure, every shadow, every fold of cloth and angle of light, into a single image of the funeral I wished upon you. I wanted you to see it. I wanted you to feel, for even one moment, what it is to look at a photograph and know that someone you love is gone. She spoke without self-pity and without defiance. She spoke the way a patient describes a symptom to a doctor, plainly because the facts must be known, and because the telling of them is the first and most necessary step towards something that might, with time and care, resemble healing. Watson felt the weight of her confession settle in the room, not as a burden, but as a presence, the way furniture settles into a space over years until it becomes part of the room's identity. The fire held its warmth around them. The clock measured the silence with its patient hand. Yesterday, Alara said, and now she looked down at the letter in her lap, and Watson saw her fingers tighten around it, the silver-stained knuckles whitening just slightly at the joints. This was returned to me. She held it out, and Holmes took it from her with a gentleness that Watson had rarely seen in those quick, decisive hands. It was a letter. The envelope was creased and travel-worn, its edges softened by time and handling, its surface marked with a constellation of postal stamps and redirections. The bureaucratic archaeology of a piece of mail that had been lost in the vast machinery of the General Post Office, and had only now, 2 years later, found its way back to its sender. The red stamp of the dead letter office was pressed across one corner, partly obscuring the address, which was written in a hand Watson recognized at once as Alara's. The same careful copper plate that had inscribed Holmes's name on the envelope containing the photograph. The letter was unopened. Holmes examined it beneath the lamp, turning it carefully, reading each stamp and redirection mark the way he might read a chapter in a book. Posted from Great Russell Street, as you say, correctly addressed to 221B Baker Street. Redirected first to the sorting office at Mount Pleasant, then to the dead letter office, then, after 18 months, returned to sender at the address listed on the reverse. He looked up at Alara. I never received this letter, Miss Finch. I never saw it. I never read it. I did not ignore your plea. I did not dismiss your brother's death. The letter was simply lost. The word lost hung in the air between them, small and enormous at the same time, the kind of word that contains within it the possibility of an entirely different history, a road not taken, a hand not held, a question asked into the dark that was answered only by its own echo returning, years later, still sealed, still waiting, still carrying inside it the hope that the sender had long since abandoned. Alara looked at the returned letter in Holmes's hands, and Watson saw the moment the understanding reached her, not as a revelation, but as a slow tide, something that had been approaching for hours and now arrived, filling the spaces that anger had occupied for 2 years with something quieter, something that did not yet have a name but felt, Watson thought, like the first tentative loosening of a fist that has been clenched so long the fingers have forgotten they can open. And in the quiet that followed, a quiet not empty but full, the way a held hand is full, Holmes did something Watson had rarely seen him do. He set the letter aside and simply listened. Holmes listens and direct address. "Tell me about Thomas," Holmes said, and the request was so unexpected, so entirely unlike the questions a detective asks, which concern themselves with facts and timelines and the position of objects in a room, that both Watson and Alara looked at him with the same expression, which was the expression of two people who have been handed something they did not know they needed. Alara blinked. About Thomas? The boy himself. Not his illness. Not his death. The boy. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment the fire crackled and the clock ticked, and the snow made its soft, continuous sound against the window, and the room waited with the patience of a room that has held many conversations and knows that the most important ones begin in silence. "He loved birds," she said, and her voice, when it came, was different, softer, younger, as though the telling of this particular truth required her to speak from a part of herself that grief had locked away but not destroyed. Finches especially. He thought it was wonderful that his name was a bird's name, and he took it as a sign that they belonged to him in some particular way. He kept a sketchbook. He drew every finch he saw, goldfinches, chaffinches, bullfinches, greenfinches, and he labeled each one with the date and the place and the weather, because he believed that a bird seen in rain was a fundamentally different creature from the same bird seen in sun. A faint smile crossed her face, and it was, Watson thought, the most beautiful thing in the room, more beautiful than the firelight, more beautiful than the snow, because it was alive, and it was hers, and it had survived 2 years of winter. He was meticulous. He was funny. He had a way of looking at ordinary things and making them seem extraordinary simply by paying attention to them. Holmes listened without moving, his gray eyes resting on Alara with the same intensity he brought to a crime scene, but turned now toward a different purpose. Not the cataloging of evidence, but the witnessing of a life. A small life. A life that had ended too soon and deserved, at the very least, to be heard about by someone who would remember. Watson's throat tightened. He looked down at his hands and saw them resting on his knee, still holding the warmth of the tea, and he let the feeling be what it was. Sadness, yes, but not the corrosive kind. The kind that acknowledges the value of what was lost by measuring the depth of the space it left behind. And if you are lying in the dark right now, and grief is with you too, if you have lost someone whose name was also a kind of music, whose absence has settled into the walls of your home, the way silence settles into an empty room, then know this: you are not alone in it. Grief, too, can be held gently. It need not be solved or cured or reasoned away. It can simply be present, the way the fire is present, the way the snow is present, giving the night its shape without asking anything in return. You are safe. Let yourself breathe here. The fire has not gone out. The night is kind. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the clouds had thinned just enough for a single star to appear above Baker Street. And Holmes, looking toward the window, began to speak of what could still be done. Chapter 6. The Turn and Resolution. Morning came to Baker Street the way mornings come to rooms where people have stayed up late and spoken honestly, slowly, with a particular tenderness, as though the light itself understood that the occupants needed to be woken gently. The frost on the sitting room windows had thickened overnight into patterns that Watson, in a fanciful mood, might have mistaken for fern fronds pressed into the glass by some patient and invisible gardener. The fire had been rebuilt. Mrs. Hudson again, her footsteps on the stairs so quiet that neither Holmes nor Watson had heard her come, and the room held that particular quality of warmth that belongs to spaces where the fire has been burning long enough to have heated not just the air, but the walls themselves, the furniture, the very grain of the wood in the floorboards, so that the warmth seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, intrinsic rather than applied. Holmes had been awake since before dawn. Watson found him at the writing desk, already in his shirt sleeves, a telegraph form completed and sealed and resting beside his elbow. "University College Hospital," Holmes said by way of greeting. "I have requested Thomas Finch's admission records and the attending physician's notes. They should arrive by the afternoon post." Alara had spent the night in Mrs. Hudson's spare room. Watson had insisted upon it, and Mrs. Hudson had seconded the insistence with a firmness that admitted no argument, and Alara, too tired to refuse, had followed the landlady down the stairs and into a small, warm room where clean sheets had been turned down and a glass of water placed on the nightstand and a candle left burning on the dresser so that she would not wake in the dark in a strange place and be afraid. She appeared now in the doorway of the sitting room, wearing the heather shawl over her own clothes, her face still pale but rested, the dark circles beneath her eyes a shade lighter than they had been the night before. Mrs. Hudson was already in the kitchen. Watson could hear the quiet industry of breakfast being prepared, the scrape of a pot across the range, the hiss of butter in a pan, the particular percussion of a wooden spoon against the rim of a porridge bowl. Within minutes the sounds had become smells: toast and butter and porridge with honey, and the bergamot tea that was as constant in this household as the ticking of the clock. They ate together. The four of them, Holmes, Watson, Alara, and Mrs. Hudson, who had been persuaded to sit at the table rather than serve it, though she kept rising to fetch things that no one had asked for, but that everyone was glad to receive. The toast was warm, the porridge was thick, the tea was strong, and the morning light, filtering through the frost-patterned glass, laid itself across the table in soft, geometric shapes that shifted as the sun climbed, painting the breadboard gold, and the teacups amber and the edge of Alara's shawl the color of late summer heather. The records arrived at 2:30, delivered by a hospital clerk who looked cold and grateful when Mrs. Hudson pressed a cup of broth into his hands before he left. Watson took the file to the desk by the window, where the light was best, and opened it with the professional care of a man who had read 1,000 such files and understood that each one represented not merely a diagnosis, but a life. A body that had breathed and moved and hoped, rendered now into clinical language and abbreviation, the medical shorthand that turns a human being into a case number and a list of symptoms. He read slowly. He read twice. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. Alara sat in the chair nearest the hearth, her hands wrapped around her tea, watching Watson's face with the expression of someone who has been waiting 2 years for an answer and is now, at the very last, almost afraid to hear it. The answer was sad. But it was also, Watson thought, clean. The kind of sadness that does not corrode because it does not contain injustice. Thomas Finch had died of a rare inflammatory fever, not influenza as initially diagnosed, but something rarer and more sudden, a condition that mimicked influenza in its early stages and then progressed with a swiftness that no treatment available in any London hospital could have prevented. The misdiagnosis was understandable. The attending physician had acted in good faith. The brief improvement on the second day, the sitting up, the sketchbook, the goldfinch drawn from memory, was consistent with the disease's known pattern of false remission. No one had been negligent. No one had been careless. The boy had simply been ill with something that medicine in its current state could not cure. Watson closed the file and looked at Holmes, and something passed between them that did not need words. The shared understanding that the truth, even a sad one, was better than the weight of not knowing. The truth told gently. Holmes crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite Ilara, and the distance between them was not the distance of an interrogation, but the distance of a conversation between two people who are being careful with each other, the way one is careful with something that has been mended and might, if handled too roughly, break again along the old lines. The fire burned between them, and its warmth was neutral, belonging to neither, offered to both. "Miss Finch," Holmes said, and his voice held a quality that Watson had heard perhaps 3 times in all their years together, a quality that he could only describe as tenderness, which in Holmes was not a softening of his nature but a deepening of it, as though his considerable powers of attention, usually directed toward the external world of evidence and deduction, had been turned inward toward something he considered more important. "Dr. Watson has reviewed your brother's medical records. I should like to tell you what he found, if you are willing to hear it." Ilara nodded. Her hands tightened around the teacup, and the tea inside it trembled faintly, a tiny seismic event visible only to someone who was watching with the kind of attention Watson was watching with now. "Thomas's illness was not influenza," Holmes said. "It was a rare inflammatory fever. Dr. Watson can provide you with the medical terminology, if you wish, that presents initially in a manner indistinguishable from common influenza, but progresses along a very different and more acute course. The attending physician's initial diagnosis was reasonable. It was not negligent. It was not careless. It was the diagnosis that any competent physician, faced with those symptoms on that first day, would have made." He paused, and the fire spoke into the pause with its low, familiar murmur, and the clock continued its patient count, and the room held its warmth around them all. The improvement on the second day, when Thomas sat up and asked for his sketchbook and drew a goldfinch from memory, is consistent with a pattern known to this disease. A brief remission, a window, a moment of false spring before the final winter. It is, I am told, one of the cruelest features of the illness, because it gives hope at the precise moment when hope is least warranted. Watson watched Ilara's face. He watched the way the information moved through her, not like a blow, but like water finding its level, filling the spaces, settling into the contours of what she had already suspected, but had never been able to confirm, displacing the questions that had occupied those spaces for 2 years, and leaving in their place something that was painful, yes, but also stable, also solid, also capable of bearing weight. "Your letter," Holmes continued, "had it reached me, would have led me to precisely the same records Dr. Watson has reviewed today. I would have found the same answer. Thomas died of an illness that could not have been cured by any physician in London, or in England, or I suspect, in the world. No one failed him. No one overlooked him. No one chose not to care." He leaned forward slightly, and his gray eyes held hers. "And you, Miss Finch, did not fail him either. You were there. You brought him to the hospital. You stayed. You were the last person he saw before he closed his eyes, and he closed his eyes knowing he was loved. That is not a failure. That is the best any of us can hope to offer the people we love." Ilara wept. She wept quietly, without sound, the tears moving down her face with the same steady patience as the snow that had been falling all night on Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson, who had been standing in the doorway, not intruding, simply present, the way a wall is present, or a roof, holding space without occupying it, crossed the room and placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder. Watson found his handkerchief and offered it, and Ilara took it, and the small square of white cotton passed between them like a flag of truce in a war that had, at last, come to its end. Holmes sat across from her and let the silence hold. He did not fill it. He did not explain. He did not move to the next question or the next deduction. He simply remained, steady and present, and the fire crackled, and the room was warm, and the grief was witnessed, not fixed, honored, not erased. After a time, Alara dried her eyes and looked at the photograph that still lay on the table, and for the first time, she did not look at it with anguish, but with something quieter, something almost like release. The photograph reframed. Holmes picked up the funeral photograph and held it in both hands, the way one holds a letter that has been read many times and has become, through the reading, something more than paper and ink. The albumin surface caught the morning light from the window, and the image seemed, for a moment, to breathe. The chapel, the mourners, the coffin, the bare branches of the winter trees, all rendered in the silver and shadow of a craft so fine it had troubled the boundary between what was real and what was imagined. This photograph, Holmes said, turning it slowly in the light, is remarkable. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it to diminish the pain that produced it. I say it because it is true. The precision of the compositing, the consistency of the light across 7 separate negatives, the rendering of emotional expression in faces assembled from disparate sources. Miss Finch, this is not merely skilled work. This is the work of someone who understands, at the deepest level, how the eye constructs meaning from light and shadow, how a viewer's mind fills in what the photographer suggests, how grief itself has a visual language, the angle of a bowed head, the fall of a veil, the distance between 2 figures standing at a grave, and you have spoken that language fluently. Alara looked at him, and Watson saw surprise move across her face like the shadow of a bird crossing a sunlit wall, brief, quick, there and gone. It was made in anger, she said quietly. It was made in grief, Holmes replied. And grief of this depth is not small. It is not weakness. It is the measure of what was loved, expressed in the only medium you had. You turned your pain into something that does not merely depict loss, but communicates it. To anyone who looks at this image, even a stranger, even a man whose own funeral it supposedly depicts. I looked at this photograph last night, Miss Finch, and what I felt was not fear. It was recognition. I recognized the quality of feeling behind it, even before I understood its source. The fire had settled to its deepest, steadiest burn, the coals glowing red-orange beneath a fine layer of white ash that looked, Watson thought, rather like the snow outside, a soft covering that held the heat within rather than letting it escape. The room was very warm now, and the light from the window had shifted from the pale gray of early morning to something richer, something closer to gold, and it lay across the table and the photograph and Holmes's hands with the generous, unhurried warmth of sunlight that has traveled 93 million miles and is in no hurry to leave now that it has arrived. The question, Holmes said, setting the photograph down and looking at Alara with the expression Watson knew best, the expression of a man who sees not what is but what could be, is what you will do now. Your gift has not diminished, Miss Finch. It has been turned toward darkness, and it produced something extraordinary even in that direction. But the gift itself belongs to you, not to your grief, and it can be directed elsewhere. He paused, and the clock ticked, and somewhere in the street below, a horse-drawn milk cart was making its slow morning passage, the glass bottles chiming faintly against each other with each cobblestone, a sound so ordinary and so comforting that Watson closed his eyes for a moment and simply listened to it, letting it be what it was. Evidence that the world outside this room was continuing its quiet business, undisturbed and undismayed. Voss misses you, Holmes said. He is too proud to say so directly, but his studio is large and cold and his eyesight is failing, and when he spoke of you last night there was a quality in his voice that was unmistakable. You are the only person he considers his equal, and he, I suspect, is the only person who understands what your hands are capable of. Holmes allowed himself the faintest shadow of a smile. You have spent 2 years photographing death, Miss Finch. Perhaps it is time to photograph the living. The world is full of goldfinches, and someone ought to be paying attention to them. Alara held the photograph a moment longer, then set it down with the care of someone laying a flower on a grave, gently, finally, and with love. Departure and direct address. Mrs. Hudson appeared with Alara's coat, which had dried overnight by the fire and now carried the smell of warm wool and the ghost of lavender from the studio where it had been worn so many hours. Alara shrugged it on, and then paused, her hands on the heather shawl at her shoulders, beginning to unfold it and return it. "You will keep that," Mrs. Hudson said, in the voice she used when she was not making a request, and Alara, who had faced down her own grief and confronted the world's most famous detective, found herself unable to argue with a landlady from Staffordshire who had decided, with the full force of her considerable will, that a young woman ought not to face a winter's day without a proper shawl. She kept it. Watson walked her to the door. The staircase creaked its familiar farewell beneath their feet, and the vestibule lamp, still burning though the morning was well advanced, cast its small, warm circle on the tiles as Alara stepped toward the threshold. She paused with her hand on the latch, and Watson saw the letter, the returned letter, the one that had been lost for 2 years and found too late, and yet perhaps not too late at all, folded carefully inside her coat pocket, its edge just visible above the fabric. She was carrying it home. She would keep it, Watson thought, not as evidence of what had gone wrong, but as proof of what she had tried to do, the reaching out, the asking for help, the refusal to accept that her brother's death needed no explanation. She had been right to write it. She had been right to ask. "Thank you, Dr. Watson," she said, and her voice was clear now, cleared of the weariness that had weighted it the night before, the way a sky clears after rain, not empty, but lighter, the clouds thinned to gauze, the possibility of blue visible behind them for the first time in a long while. Watson opened the door, and the winter morning entered the vestibule with its clean, cold breath, and Alara stepped into it, the heather shawl around her shoulders, the snow bright on the pavement, the pale sun laying its gold across the rooftops of Baker Street. She walked away without looking back, and Watson watched her go, and she seemed to him lighter than when she had arrived, not by the weight of the grief she had set down, because grief is not something that can be set down entirely, but by the weight of the anger she no longer needed, and the guilt she no longer deserved, and the silence she no longer had to carry alone. He closed the door and climbed the stairs and found Holmes at the window, watching the same figure recede along the whitened street. Neither of them spoke. Watson poured fresh tea. The kettle had been kept warm, as it always was, by Mrs. Hudson's invisible hand, and the sound of the liquid meeting the cup was the most ordinary sound in the world, and for that reason, the most comforting. The mystery is resolved. The night is settling. You have been here this whole time, carried along, held in the warmth of this room and the company of these people, and nothing was asked of you but your presence. Let the story now begin to soften further, the way embers bank themselves when the evening is done, not dying but resting, holding their heat close for the quiet hours ahead. You are doing so well. You are exactly where you need to be. And Baker Street, that steady old street, that street that had held so many stories within its walls, settled once more into the quiet rhythms of an ordinary winter day, which is to say, a beautiful one. Chapter 7. The Settling and Sleep Landing. The afternoon passed the way certain winter afternoons do, not as a progression from one hour to the next, but as a single sustained note, a long exhalation of gray-gold light that neither brightened nor dimmed, but simply held itself at the precise frequency of contentment. The sitting room at 221B had achieved the particular temperature that Watson associated with the best hours of the season, warm enough that the body forgets it has edges, cool enough that the blanket across the knees still feels like a gift. The fire had been banked to its lowest, steadiest state, the coals a deep red beneath their veil of ash, giving off heat in the manner of something that has been warm for so long, it no longer needs to try. Holmes had taken up his violin sometime after 3 o'clock. Watson could not recall the precise moment. It had happened the way weather happens, gradually and inevitably, so that by the time he was aware of the music it had already been playing for some time, woven into the room's atmosphere as naturally as the light from the window and the tick of the clock. The melody was unfamiliar to Watson, slow and low, written in a minor key that might have been melancholy in a lesser performer's hands, but which Holmes played with a restraint that turned sadness into something gentler. Not grief, but the memory of grief. Not loss, but the gratitude that exists on the far side of loss. The quiet recognition that something beautiful once existed, and that its having existed is not diminished by its ending. The bow moved across the strings with the patience of a hand stroking a sleeping animal, each note drawn out to its full length before the next one began, and the sound filled the room the way lamplight fills a room, not by forcing itself into the corners, but by softening them, by turning sharp angles into warm curves and hard surfaces, into the suggestion of surfaces, so that the room itself seemed to be listening. The bookshelves and the mantelpiece and the frost-patterned windows all leaning in slightly, the way an audience leans in when something true is being said very quietly, Watson read. Or rather, he held a book open on his knee and allowed his eyes to rest on the page while the music moved through him. Mrs. Hudson had brought scones at 3:30, warm, with butter and blackcurrant preserves, and the smell of them lingered in the air alongside the coal smoke and the rosin dust from the violin's bow and the bergamot from the teacup that sat, half-finished and still faintly warm, on the table beside Watson's chair. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, amber and thick, and it caught the dust motes that floated above the fire in their slow, purposeless dance, each one a small planet drifting through a warm cosmos that asked nothing of it and had nowhere in particular to send it. Snow had begun again. Watson could see it through the window, falling in the particular way that late afternoon snow falls in London. Softly, slowly, as though the sky were not releasing it but allowing it to leave, one flake at a time, with the reluctance of a parent letting go of a child's hand at the schoolhouse gate. The gas lamps along Baker Street were being lit by the lamplighter, who moved from post to post with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has performed the same task 1,000 times and still finds something sacred in it. And each lamp, as it caught, added its small amber testimony to the gathering dusk. The violin trailed away into a final, held note, and then into silence. And the silence was not empty but full, the way a room is full after music has been in it. Watson opened his journal, the leather-bound one he kept in the drawer of the side table for moments exactly like this, when the events of a case had settled enough to be written about, but not so much that they had lost the warmth of being recent. The pen felt good in his hand, familiar and weighted, and the scratch of the nib against the page was a sound that belonged to this room as surely as the ticking of the clock, another instrument in the small domestic orchestra of 221B. He did not begin with the facts. The facts could wait. They would be there tomorrow and the day after that, patient and unchanging. Instead, he began with what he was feeling, which was harder to name and therefore more important to set down before it faded. The way one presses a flower, not because the flower is rare, but because the afternoon in which it was picked will not come again. He wrote about Elara Finch, not the Elara who had composed a funeral photograph of extraordinary skill and sent it to Baker Street as an act of grief transformed into art, but the Elara who had sat in this very chair and spoken of her brother's goldfinch drawings with a smile that was the bravest thing Watson had seen in months. He wrote about Thomas, the boy who believed that a bird seen in rain was a different creature from the same bird seen in sun, and he thought what a fine mind that was, what a gentle and particular way of attending to the world, and how the world was smaller for its absence. He wrote about Holmes, not the Holmes of the magnifying glass and the deductions, but the Holmes who had sat across from a grieving woman and asked her to tell him about the boy, not the case, not the clue, but the boy. The Holmes who had listened, who had been still, who had, in his own angular and improbable way, offered comfort not through words of reassurance, but through the simple, radical act of paying attention to someone who had not been paid attention to in a very long time. He wrote about Mrs. Hudson's shawl, and the way Alara had kept it, and the way small acts of kindness accumulate in a life the way snow accumulates on a quiet street, each one nearly invisible on its own, but together, over time, changing the entire landscape. And if you are still listening, if the night has not yet taken you fully into its care, if your eyes are closed, but your mind is still half here, half wandering the gaslit rooms of Baker Street, then know that this story was always, in its quiet way, about you. About the things you carry, about the letters you have written that were never answered, and the grief you have held that was never witnessed, and the small, brave acts of continuing that no one sees, but that are, in truth, the most extraordinary things any of us ever do. You have carried things today. Set them down now. The room is warm. The story has ended well. And you, wherever you are not alone. Not tonight, not in this hour, not in this gentle dark that holds you. Watson closed his journal, set down his pen, and looked across at Holmes, who had fallen still in his chair, eyes closed, hands folded, breathing slowly, and thought that even the world's most restless mind, in the end, finds its way to quiet. The room stills. The fire had reached its final, deepest state, the state beyond flame, beyond crackle, beyond even the soft collapse of coals against one another. It glowed. That was all. A steady, undemanding warmth that radiated from the grate like the memory of a conversation that was finished, but whose feeling remained present in the room long after the last word had been spoken. The light it cast was no longer amber, but something deeper, the color of honey held up to a candle, the color of the last inch of tea in a cup that has been nursed through a long and companionable evening. The gas lamps had been turned down to their lowest setting, and the room existed now in a kind of twilight that was neither dark nor light, but the gentle territory between them, a borderland where shadows were not sharp but soft, where the edges of furniture had been rounded by the dim glow into shapes that suggested, rather than insisted, the way a well-loved face is remembered, not in every precise detail, but in the feeling of its presence. Baker Street, beyond the window, had achieved perfect stillness. The snow had stopped. The cabs had ceased their passing. The gas lamps stood at their posts like sentinels who had been told that the danger was over, and they might rest now, and their light lay across the unbroken white of the street in long, soft pools of gold. Not a footprint marred the surface, not a wheel track. The city had been made new overnight, and it lay there in its newness, patient and clean and quiet, a letter that had been sealed but not yet posted, holding its contents close. The clock ticked. It had been ticking all evening, all night, all through the story, but now its sound had changed, not in pitch or in rhythm, but in the quality of attention Watson gave to it. He heard it the way one hears a heartbeat, not as a sound at all, but as a presence, as proof that time was passing, and that its passage was gentle, and that nothing was required of him except to be here, in this chair, in this room, in this moment that was already becoming the next moment with the imperceptible grace of water becoming steam. Watson pulled the blanket from the arm of his chair and drew it across his knees, and the wool was heavy and warm, and it smelled of the lavender sachets Mrs. Hudson placed in the linen cupboard, a scent so familiar he could not have named the moment he first encountered it. It had simply always been there, like the clock, like the fire, like Holmes breathing softly in the chair opposite, his face half lit by the glow from the grate, his long hands folded across his chest, rising and falling with each slow breath. The funeral photograph still lay on the table between them, its silver surface catching the last of the firelight, and it seemed to Watson in this quiet hour, not like a threat, but like a work of art made by a woman who had loved someone so much that even her anger was a kind of devotion. He would leave it there, he decided. He would not file it away. He would let it rest on the mantelpiece of 221B, among the unanswered letters and the Persian slipper and the magnifying glass, and it would become, in time, just another artifact of a life lived among mysteries, a reminder that even the strangest questions have human answers, and that the human answers are always, in the end, about love. His eyes closed, the clock ticked, the fire glowed, the night held Baker Street in its patient, white-gloved hands. And so, the night comes, as it always does, as it always will, gentle and unhurried and full of rest. The voice remains. The story is finished now. The mystery has been answered. The photograph has been understood, and the woman who made it has walked out into the snow carrying a shawl she was given by a woman who understood that warmth is never a small thing. Holmes rests in his chair. Watson rests in his. Mrs. Hudson has turned down the lamps and drawn the curtains, and the house at 221B Baker Street has settled into the particular hush of a building that knows it is loved and returns the feeling in the only way a building can, by being warm, by being steady, by holding its occupants gently through the long hours of the night. And now the story turns to you. Not the you who has been listening, though you have been a fine and faithful listener, and the story is grateful for your company, but the you who is here, in this room, in this bed, or this chair, in this body that has carried you through another day and is asking now, in its patient way, if it might rest. Let it. Let your shoulders settle deeper into whatever holds them. Let the small muscles of your jaw unclench, if they have been holding. Sometimes they hold without our knowing, the way a fist closes in sleep. And the letting go is so gentle you may not even feel it happen, only notice afterward that something has eased. The images from the story may still be with you. The snow on Baker Street, the amber glow of the sitting room, the old photographer in his studio with his shawl and his mulled wine, the stained fingers of a young woman holding a cup of tea, the sound of a violin playing a melody that had no name but needed none. Let them remain if they wish. Let them dissolve if they prefer. They are yours either way, given freely, asked for nothing in return. The fire in the grate at 221B has dimmed to its deepest ember, and the clock on the mantelpiece has not stopped, but has grown so quiet that it seems to be ticking, not in the room but somewhere further away, somewhere behind the walls, somewhere beneath the floor, a heartbeat belonging not to the clock itself, but to the house, to the street, to the night that holds them all. The snow lies on Baker Street in its perfect, undisturbed white, and the gas lamps burn their patient gold, and the world has been made safe again, not because danger has been defeated, but because understanding has arrived, quiet as snow, and settled over everything. And if you are still listening, that is good too. There is no wrong way to rest. There is only this, the quiet, and you within it. The final breath. The night is very still now. Wherever you are, the night is still. The sounds of the waking world have drawn back, the way the tide draws back from the shore, not vanishing, only retreating, making space for the quieter things to be heard. Your own breathing, the rustle of cloth, the warmth of the place where your body meets the bed, that particular warmth that belongs only to you, made by you, held for you, asking nothing in return but that you remain. A window somewhere looks out upon the world, and beyond it the sky has cleared, and a single field of snow lies white and undisturbed beneath a moon that has risen without announcement, casting its silver across the ground in a light so gentle it does not wake the sleepers, does not trouble the dreamers, does not ask to be noticed. It is simply there. It is simply enough. The way the night is enough. The way the quiet is enough. The way you, lying here, breathing here, resting here, are enough, wholly, completely, without condition and without amendment. The story has been told. The fire has been banked. The people you have spent this evening with are safe in their rooms, in their chairs. in the warm and lampless dark that is not darkness at all, but a different kind of light. A softer one, the kind that closes the eyes rather than opens them. Mrs. Hudson's shawl is draped over Ilara's shoulders in a small room in Bloomsbury. Holmes's violin rests in its case. Watson's journal lies closed upon the table, its pages holding the words that will become the story you have just heard, which is also the story of the night you are living through right now, which is also, in its way, a love letter. To rest, to safety, to the ordinary miracle of lying down and letting go. Sleep now, if you will, and know that when the morning comes, the world will still be here, quiet and kind and waiting.